Our sermon this morning is called Out of Fear. This is part one in a series or series being titled Fearless. And fair warning, if you do decide to come to Camp Yorktown Bay Family Camp, you'll be hearing these again, or at least another version of them. And our main story on this today comes from Exodus chapter 3, verses 10 and 11. And to give you a little bit of background on this, we have to really cover everything before this in the book of Exodus. We have, after the famine that had taken over in Egypt and had spread into the land of Canaan, while Joseph was there and was serving the Pharaoh and became the number 2 man in all of Egypt. After this had taken place and his family had joined him there, and there was a Pharaoh now who did not know Joseph and did not know the honor of the children of Israel and the place that they held in Egypt because of what Joseph had done and what God had done through Joseph for the people. The people were brought into a situation of slavery and forced labor. And as the people were growing in their strength, growing in their number, the Pharaoh ordered that all of the little boys, as they were being born, were to be killed, so that this people would not be strong enough to rise up against the Egyptians. The mother of Moses actually being more of his Egyptian name, Moshe, was his Hebrew name, took him, put him in a basket, and hid him among the reeds in the Nile River. And while he was there, he was found by the Pharaoh's daughter, and she decided to adopt him, to have his own family raise him until such time as he could join into the family of Pharaoh and begin to learn the ways and train to become the next king over the land of Egypt. And it is sometime after this training had taken place in Moses' adulthood that he goes out and he sees the Hebrew people. He sees their forced labor and he wants to do something about it. He feels that this is wrong, and he sees an Egyptian slave driver beating one of the Hebrews. And Moses is filled with anger at this, and he looks around. Those of you who are parents, you may know this look. That checking to make sure no one's watching because I'm about to do something I know I shouldn't do. When I worked at summer camp, while we were in our campfire meetings, and while the camp pastor was preaching, us as staff, our eyes were to be at least partially always on the kids, looking for that look of danger, that look of trouble of, am I going to get caught for what I'm about to do? And if they were near us, our job was simply to either quietly get their attention, and generally it was the male staff sitting with the boys, the female staff sitting with the girls, and just a gentle hand on their shoulder for just a second when that look of danger would come out, for them to know you are being watched. People see what you're doing. But Moses, he undertook that look of danger. He looked all over. He could not find anyone of any authority, and he went, he struck, and he killed the Egyptian slave driver and buried him in the sand. Hid him away, hid his body away, buried him in the sand. And the scripture tells us that the next day he went out among his people again, and he saw two Hebrews who were fighting. And one of them seems to have been winning, and he goes over to that one and he says, "Hey, why are you beating your fellow Hebrew? Why are you hitting and striking him?" And that other Hebrew looks at Moses and he says, "Who are you to talk to me? Are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian?" And Moses realizes word has gotten out about what he did. And the word got to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh sought to have Moses killed. So Moses fled the land of Egypt. And it's an interesting thing that Moses looks and he's so afraid of the Pharaoh's wrath, he flees the land of Egypt and he finds himself in the land of Midian. And there, as he goes to Midian, he finds a well, and he goes and he sits himself by the well. And there's a number of young women who come tending their father's herd, bringing themselves and the herd to the well. But there are other shepherds who are coming along also, and they don't want to wait and defer their time at the well to the women. And so they talk badly to them and it causes them trying to tell them to go away. But Moses stands up for them, puts on that bravado, and drives away the shepherds, and then waters the flocks of the women who are of Jethro's daughters. And Moses ends up taking up a simpler life, keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. And he does this for many years. And while he's doing this, God appears to him in a bush, which was on fire, but was not consumed. Moses has to go check it out, and there he receives a call to an idea he was probably dreading since the day he had fled Egypt. God called him to go back. Now, the Pharaoh that had wanted and sought Moses' life had since died. But still, Moses was afraid of going back. And we see this well as God calls him. He says in Exodus chapter 3, verses 10 and 11, he says, this is the Lord speaking to Moses. "So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Now, when we look at this text in just the vacuum of just this text, we're like, oh yeah, no, Moses is being very humble. He's going through all of this. Who is Moses that he could go and stand up to the Pharaoh? He was one who was being trained to be the Pharaoh, the adopted son of the Pharaoh's daughter. God knew whom he was calling. And while he had taken time with Moses to work with the sheep of Jethro's flock, for him to learn better and kinder and godlier ways of leadership than he learned in Pharaoh's house and in the schools of the Egyptians, God knew who he was calling to go and do the job. And the thing is that God then encourages Moses. Moses saying, well, who am I that I should go? Out of everyone who had been in Egypt and had left and was then going to need to go back to do that, who else but Moses to go and bring the people of Israel out, demonstrating God's power? But Moses is like, no, not me. He's afraid. In verse 12, God says, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. But even with that confirmation, that prophecy of what is going to take place, Moses remembered the way he left Egypt. He remembered the scorn that he received even from his fellow Hebrew, and knew that because of what he had done before, he might not be accepted. Or it could simply be just the fact that he had run away and been gone so many years that he thought he might not be accepted. So he asks God to give him more and better evidence as to who has sent him to do this thing. God gives Moses then his name. He says, I am that I am. When they ask you who sent you, you say the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, I am, has sent me. And God tells Moses that even the Pharaoh will listen to him when he says, I am coming in the name of I am, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. But again, Moses comes back with reservations. Well, what if they don't believe me? So the Lord has Moses throw his staff on the ground. And he turns it into a snake. And after Moses jumps back from it, anytime, and I don't care what kind of a person you are, if you like snakes, if you like these kinds of things, if they come out at you from nowhere, if they come out unexpected, it's going to startle you. It's going to scare you. And here Moses jumps back from this snake that God has transformed his staff into, and God tells him to grab it by the tail. Now, how many of you know a thing or two about snakes? How many of you know if you're going to handle a snake, where is the least safe place to grab a snake? That's right, it's the tail. Because the snake is so flexible, they can wind themselves up so well that when you grab a snake, if you do not grab it at the neck, you are highly likely to get bit. And I know this firsthand. While I was on a backpacking trip in the Sespe Canyon Wilderness as a child in California, one of the campgrounds that we would use, which was next to the river, I saw a small snake. It was about a foot long. And it was a garter snake. And it was a type that we called a red racer. We called it a red racer for two reasons. One is it had two little red pinstripes down the side. And two, it's fast. Well, I saw this red racer snake taking its time and just slowly moving through our camp. I looked at it, I identified it, I'm like, that's not a venomous snake. And I thought, I'm going to catch it. So I made my way over to the snake, positioned myself in its path in such a way that I might be able to grab it. But as I reached down, it saw me and darted forward. And so while I had timed, based off of the speed it had been going, I had timed it right that I would get it just behind the head and be completely safe in picking this thing up and not get bit. I ended up being too slow because it darted forward and I barely grabbed it by the tail. And when I say barely grabbed it by the tail, I mean I had the tail between these two fingers and my thumb. Where I was going to have the whole hand, I missed by almost an entire foot. And when I grabbed it, I got a good enough hold. I picked it up and I was bringing my other hand, my left hand around to try and grab the snake by its neck. And it whipped around. And as I'm coming in like this, it latched itself onto my thumb. It hurt a little bit. But more than hurting, it annoyed me and startled me. So I looked at it for a second, and I tried to grab it again to have it let go. And it, this is the strength of these snakes, folks. Using the anchor point of its mouth on the skin of my thumb, it moved out of the way of my hand and I couldn't grab it. And at this point, very frustrated with the snake, I flung my hand down as hard as I could, and it let go, landed on the ground, and slithered out of the camp. And all of my attempts, I was left with some teeth marks in my thumb. Excuse me. Now, I wouldn't have tried any of that had I not been able to identify the snake. Had I not been able to identify positively that this was not a venomous snake. And in Southern California, where we were very prone to have western diamondback rattlesnakes. In fact, in all of my almost 7 years living in California, I had the distinct privilege of encountering at least one western diamondback rattlesnake every single year that we lived there. Every single year. And the reason is we had this big cement patio in our backyard. And in the spring, as the snakes were coming out from their hibernation, they needed to warm up. The snakes are cold-blooded. And so in their desire and their seeking to warm up, they found our nice white cement patio, which gave them plenty of warmth, plenty of sun where they would warm up. And my brother and I, without fail, every spring, someday when we would come home from school, we would hear our dog barking. And we knew the bark. Thank you. We knew the bark well. And we could hear her from half a block away. We lived up on a hill that was about a block long. And so as we're walking up the hill home from school, we hear the barking. And we're like, oh, great. There's a snake in the backyard. And our dog was maybe about that big. It was a small little mutt, part corgi. Gives you a little bit more of an idea of the size. I've dealt with these things. I knew what could happen. Eventually, there was one year that there was a baby rattlesnake, very small one, about a foot long. And they don't have a lot of control of how much venom they will release when they bite. And my dog was used to looking at 6 and 7 foot long rattlesnakes that she was like, I can't tangle with this. I'll alert the humans and let them know, but I can't handle this. Well, a little baby rattlesnake she thought she could handle, and she went in and she got bit. And in everything with that, I've seen the difference in all of these things. And what can happen if you get bit by a non-venomous snake? What can happen if you get bit by a venomous snake? So imagine Moses, who has just been startled by his shepherd's staff, which God has commanded him to throw down. He throws it down onto the ground, and it turns into a snake. Now, the word that's used here in the Hebrew for snake it doesn't give us any indication if it is venomous or not. And you go through, and it is the word it's just generic word for snake. We have today different words. You have a python. They're not venomous, but they're more of a constrictor type snake in a lot of cases. You have vipers, which are venomous. We have different words for different kinds of snakes. But generally, this was just snake. So we have no idea if this snake that God has turned the staff into is a venomous snake or a non-venomous snake. And honestly, for matters of faith and trust in God, I tend to think it's a venomous snake. And God tells Moses, pick up the venomous snake by the tail. All of this just screams bad idea. But looking at the fire, hearing God's voice speaking to him out of a bush that is burning but not consumed, Moses is filled with courage, and he grabs the snake, and no sooner are his hands on it and he's picking it up than it turns back into his staff. Even more than this, God then tells Moses to put his hand inside his cloak. And then when he takes it out, it's covered with leprosy. It's gone completely snow white and incredibly diseased and leprous. Now, the Exodus records the reaction of Moses in these events as the Hebrew word hine, which is often translated as behold. And in many things he looks and he says, and this reaction, we often put this idea onto how these things go. And especially when we hear a word like behold, or we read a word like behold, it's not like, oh, behold, it's behold. That here Moses, he's just picked up a venomous snake, been startled by it. Now he's put his hand inside his coat, and it comes out with one of the most contagious diseases known to man all over it. And to give the concept that he's just like, oh yeah, that's cool. Let's be real for a second here. Moses is freaking out a little bit. But God tells him to put his hand back inside his coat, back inside his cloak, and he pulls it out, and he is back to being clean and restored like the rest of his body. And God tells him in Exodus chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, he says, if they will not believe you or heed the first sign, which is the staff being turned into the snake, they may believe the second sign. And if they will not believe even these two signs or heed you, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. 3 signs that God gives to Moses for proving the reality of the calling that Moses has received from God. So naturally, because Moses is still afraid, He seems to be okay in the presence of God, where he's, in the presence of the burning bush, and he hears the voice directly speaking to him to do things that are mind-blowingly terrifying when we really boil them down to what's going on. But because he is afraid, and he's afraid of going back to Egypt, even more than he's afraid of picking up what is potentially a venomous viper, or even more afraid of his hand becoming leprous, he is afraid of going back to Egypt. In verse 10, it says, "But Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." First it was, well, what if they don't believe that you've sent me? Well, tell them my name. What if they still don't believe? Here are 3 miraculous signs that I will do, and here's 2 of them that I'm doing in front of you, so you know I have the power to do it. And now Moses realizes, well, there's no way they won't believe me, so the only way I can get out of this is if I can convince God that I am a bad public speaker. If I can convince God that I'm going to be too nervous to be able to speak and do what he's calling me to do, that I'm going to be too chicken to go and speak to Pharaoh, and my mouth is just going to close up, and my saliva will dry up, and I'll be unable to speak anything. So maybe that will get God to send someone else. So he says, I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. And God responds, who gives speech to mortals? Who makes the mute or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? He says, now go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to speak. Man, I know when I was going through seminary and going through studying for my degree in theology at Walla Walla, that if I had this kind of a thing, I would have been much more confident stepping in to preach. Now I'll tell you this: I have been given a gift to speak in public. I have done things up front in our church since I was a young boy, and even then, this was in front of 400, 500, 600 people at times, and it was like nothing. The only times that I have been nervous going up front is with what I had to say. I still get nervous sometimes of what I have to say. And to have this message from God, I'm going to tell you this right now. Every pastor, every earnest preacher you have ever heard or met would absolutely love to have had God say this to them directly. Go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to speak. Because that tells me I'm not responsible for the content. God is going to give the content. All I have to do is be available, and his ability will take me where he wants me to go. That is all. But this still isn't enough for Moses, and he realizes he has no more escape. And so he simply says, verse 13, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." Moses' fear is taking over. He's still trying to get out of it. He's still trying to not do the job that God is calling him to do, that God had raised him up to do. Verses 14 through 17 communicate what God said next. It says, "Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses." Now remember, this is Moses who is recording this situation later on and writing all of this down for us and others to be able to read. So Moses knows firsthand the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And up until this point, I imagine that God's voice has been very kind. That God's voice has his tone of voice has exuded patience, has exuded sensitivity, has exuded all of the things that are needed to kindly coax Moses to do what God is calling him to do. And after God has met every single one of Moses' objections, however legitimate they may be, and he still begs, please send someone else, God comes back with tone. What of your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he can speak fluently. Even now he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, his heart will be glad. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. He indeed shall speak for you to the people. He shall serve as a mouth for you, and you shall serve as God for him. Take in your hand this staff with which you shall perform the sign. There's no more questioning. There's no more calling. This is all given in the imperative. These are things that God is now saying, you don't have a choice in this. Aaron is coming. You don't want to speak. Fine. Aaron can be your mouthpiece. But you're doing this because I've called you to do this. I specifically have engineered your life for you to do this. The story continues to unfold from this point. Moses and Aaron, they meet up. They end up going back to Egypt. They speak to Pharaoh. Pharaoh's heart is hardened again and again and again and again and again and again. It's probably not the right number of agains. Consider it 9 agains. And after the night of Passover, after Pharaoh's own firstborn son is taken from him, the Israelites are not only permitted to go, but are commanded to do so. And so Moses' career as a leader of people started off with him all but kicking and screaming while being dragged to do it. He wasn't as against doing what God wanted him to do as Jonah was. But Moses was trying desperately to get out of this situation because of his fear. But you notice, as Moses gets to know God better, as he comes to understand the character of God, he loses the fear. He loses the fear. And it doesn't take very long for the fear to go away while he is up on the mountain of Sinai after the people of Israel have created a golden calf to worship because they're like, well, Moses has been gone for 40 days. He's not coming back down the mountain. He's probably dead up there. Aaron, we need something to worship. Make for us a golden calf. And in all of this, as the anger of the Lord is kindled against them, Moses appeals to the Lord on their behalf, saying, in all that you did to bring them out of Egypt, are you going to let everyone say you brought them out so that you could destroy them yourself? Moses was beginning to learn the character of God. And he gets to a point after this, he says, Lord, show me your glory. He realizes not just the strength and the power of God, but the beauty of his character, and he wants to know him fully. It didn't take long for Moses to learn the lesson that we see that John writes in 1 John 4:18. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. Here's the lesson that Moses needed to learn. God called him because he loved him and loved his people. And the more that Moses came to know who God is, the more that he came to realize what God was about, the less afraid he was of various circumstances and situations that he was placed in as leader of the Israelites. And as he came to know the love of God, the perfect love of God took away the fear in him. But until the time that he fully knew the love of God as God expressed it to him on the mountain, Moses did the job while afraid. He left Midian, he left his father-in-law and the responsibility that he had with his flocks to go and do the job that God called him to do, even though he was still afraid to do it. With everything God had given him, he was still afraid to do it, but he knew he had to. And the first step in becoming fearless is learning to do scary things while scared. And when God calls you to do something that is scary to you, you can be assured that He is not going to let whatever fear you have be realized. Because He has perfect love, and His perfect love will cast out the fear if we stay in our connection with Him. If we trust Him, if we have our faith in Him, the fear cannot take over us, and the fear will not be realized. And as much as sometimes we have to do something that gives us fear, do something we are afraid of, do something that seems scary, God calls us to do it in His strength, even while we're scared. The first step of being fearless is not letting fear stop you. Fearlessness is not having no fear of anything, not having any hesitation, not having any questions. Fearlessness is not an inability to recognize danger, or even an inability to care about danger. Fearlessness in God is recognizing that whatever danger there is, God can handle it and will handle it for me when I am doing His will. So even though I may be scared, even though I may be full of fear, even though I may be nervous, fearlessness starts with doing things while full of fear. And learning that the fear is a liar. Learning that the fear is a plague of doubt. Learning that the fear is not legitimate. And that we are safe in His hand. When we are called out of fear, one of the first things that God will do in calling us out of fear is call us to a mission. Call us to speak up or speak out for Him. with the words that he gives, with the tone that he gives us, in his character. He encourages us, he calls us to stand up for him because he has stood up for us. Let us pray. Our gracious Father in heaven, we thank you so much for all that you have done for us. We are thankful that you call us out of sin, call us into salvation, and that you call us even more into a mission. And though we may be fearful, Lord, we thank you that you are bigger than all of our fears, and you can handle everything that the world may throw at us. Lord, we ask that you will take away any spirit of fear in us, that you will grow us closer to you, that we may know your character, know your perfect love, and have that fear cast out of our lives, that we may live for you and do what you have called us to do. And in the meantime, give us the courage to do what you call us to do, even when we are scared, so that we can see your power, that we can see your glory and your love at work. We ask this always in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.